We ran 8 miles down the valley, through a village or two, and I could not help noticing several strange-looking folk lounging by the roadside. These were the watchers, who would have had much to say to me if I had come in any other garb or company. As it was, they looked incuriously on. One touched his cap in salute, and I responded graciously. As the dark fell, I turned up a side glen which, as I remembered from the map, led into an unfrequented corner of the hills. Presently we came to a lone moor, where the night was blackening the sunset gleam in the bog pools. Here we stopped. I reversed the car, got out, and restored to Mr. Jopley his belongings. "1,000 thanks," I said. "There's more use in you than I thought. Now be off and find the police." I spent the night on a shelf of the hillside, in the lee of a boulder where the heather grew long and soft. It was a cold business, for I had neither coat nor waistcoat. These were in Mr. Turnbull's keeping, as was Scudder's little book, my watch, and worst of all my pipe and tobacco pouch. Only my money accompanied me in my belt, and about half a pound of ginger biscuits in my trousers pocket. I woke very cold and stiff about an hour after dawn. I raised myself on my arms and looked down into the valley, and that one look set me lacing up my boots in mad haste, for there were men below, not more than a quarter of a mile off, spaced out on the hillside like a fan and beating the heather. Marmee had not been slow in looking for his revenge. I crawled out of my shelf into the cover of a boulder. 20 yards of open ground separated me from a shallow trench which slanted up the mountain face. The police had evidently called in the best of the local talent, for they spotted me as soon as I broke cover, and hallooed at the sight. Ignoring the trench, I made best speed to the top of the hill, and came out on a high road, which made a pass between 2 glens. All in front of me was a big field of heather sloping up to the crest, which was crowned with an odd feather of trees. In the dike by the roadside was a gate, from which a grass-grown track led over the first wave of the moor. I jumped the dike and followed it, and after a few hundred yards, as soon as it was out of sight of the highway, the grass stopped and it became a very respectable road, which was evidently kept with some care. I did not follow the road, but the burn side which flanked it on the right, where the bracken grew deep and the high banks made a tolerable screen. It was well I did so, for no sooner had I gained the hollow than, looking back, I saw the pursuit topping the ridge from which I had descended. After that I did not look back. I had no time. I ran up the burnside, crawling over the open places, and for a large part wading in the shallow stream. I found a deserted cottage with a row of phantom peat stacks and an overgrown garden. Then I was among young hay, and very soon had come to the edge of a plantation of wind-blown firs. From there I saw the chimneys of a house smoking a few hundred yards to my left. I forsook the burnside, crossed another dike, and almost before I knew I was on a lawn. A glance back told me that I was well out of sight of the pursuit, which had not yet passed the first lift of the moor. The house before me was an ordinary moorland farm, with a more pretentious whitewashed wing added. Attached to this wing was a glass veranda, and through the glass I saw the face of an elderly gentleman meekly watching me. I stalked over the border of coarse hill gravel and entered the open veranda door. Within was a pleasant room, glass on one side, and on the other a mass of books. There was a knee-hole desk in the middle, and seated at it with some papers and open volumes before him was a benevolent old gentleman. His face was round and shiny, like Mr. Pickwick's. Big glasses were stuck on the end of his nose, and the top of his head was as bright and bare as a glass bottle. He never moved when I entered, but raised his placid eyebrows. "You seem in a hurry, my friend," he said slowly. I nodded towards the window. It gave a prospect across the moor through a gap in the plantation, and revealed certain figures half a mile off struggling through the heather. "Ah, I see," he said, and took up a pair of field glasses through which he patiently scrutinized the figures. "A fugitive from justice, eh? Well, we'll go into the matter at our leisure. Meantime, I object to my privacy being broken in upon by the clumsy rural policeman. Go into my study, and you will see 2 doors facing you. Take the one on the left and close it behind you. You will be perfectly safe." And this extraordinary man took up his pen again. I did as I was bid, and found myself in a little dark chamber, which smelt of chemicals, and was lit only by a tiny window high up in the wall. The door had swung behind me with a click like the door of a safe. Once again I had found an unexpected sanctuary. No sound came to me in that dark place. I tried to possess my soul in patience, and to forget how hungry I was. Then there was a click, and the door stood open. I emerged into the sunlight, to find the master of the house sitting in a deep armchair in the room he called his study, and regarding me with curious eyes. "Have they gone?" I asked. "They have gone. I convinced them that you had crossed the hill. I do not choose that the police should come between me and one whom I am delighted to honour. This is a lucky morning for you, Mr. Richard Hannay." As he spoke, his eyelids seemed to tremble and fall a little over his keen grey eyes. In a flash, the phrase of Scudder's came back to me, when he had described the man that he most dreaded in the world. He had said that he could hood his eyes like a hawk. Then I saw that I had walked straight into the enemy's headquarters. My first impulse was to throttle the old ruffian and make for the open air. He seemed to anticipate my intention, for he smiled gently and nodded to the door behind me. I turned and saw 2 manservants who had me covered with pistols. He knew my name, but he had never seen me before, and as the reflection darted across my mind, I saw a slender chance. "I don't know what you mean," I said roughly. "And who are you calling Richard Hannay? My name's Ainsley." "So," he said, still smiling, "we won't quarrel about a name." I reflected that my garb, blacking coat and waistcoat and collar, would, at any rate, not betray me. I put on my surliest face and shrugged my shoulders. "I suppose you're going to give me up after all and call it a damn dirty trick. My God, I wish I'd never seen that cursed motor car. Here's the money and be damned to you." And I flung 4 sovereigns on the table. He opened his eyes a little. "Oh, no, I shall not give you up. My friends and I will have a little private settlement with you, that's all. You know a little too much, Mr. Hannay. You are a clever actor, but not quite clever enough." He spoke with assurance, but I could see the dawning of a doubt in his mind. "Oh, for God's sake, stop jawing," I cried. "Everything's against me. I haven't had a bit of luck since I came on shore at Leith. What's the harm in a poor devil picking up some money he finds in a bust-up motor car? That's all I've done. And for that I've been chivied for 2 days by those blasted bobbies over these blasted hills. I tell you, I'm fair sick of it. You can do what you like, old boy. Ned Ainsley's got no fight left in him." I could see that the doubt was gaining. "Will you oblige me with the story of your recent doings?" he asked. I told him my story, how I had come off an Archangel ship at Leith a week ago and was making my way overland to my brother in Wigtown. I'd run short of cash, and I was pretty well on my uppers, when I had come on a hole in a hedge and had seen a big motor car lying in the burn. I had found 3 sovereigns lying on the seat and 1 on the floor, and I'd pocketed the cash. "They can have the money back," I cried. "For a fat lot of good it's done me. Those parishes are all down on the poor man. Now, if it had been you, Governor, that had found the quids, nobody would have troubled you." "You're a good liar, Hannay." "I tell you my name's Ainsley. I'd sooner have the police than you with your Hannays and your monkey-faced pistol tricks." No, Governor, I beg your pardon. I don't mean that. I'm much obliged to you. I'll thank you to let me go now the coast's clear." "I do not propose to let you go. If you are what you say you are, you will soon have a chance of clearing yourself. And if you are what I believe you are, I do not think you will see the light much longer." He rang a bell, and a third servant appeared from the veranda. "I want the Lanchester in 5 minutes," he said. "There will be 3 to luncheon." Then he looked steadily at me, and that was the hardest ordeal of all. "Carl," he spoke in German to one of the men in the doorway, "you will put this fellow in the storeroom till I return, and you'll be answerable to me for his keeping." I was marched out of the room, with a pistol at each ear. The storeroom was a damp chamber, in what had been the old farmhouse. There was nothing to sit down on but a school form. It was black as pitch, but the windows were heavily shuttered. I made out by groping that the walls were lined with boxes and barrels and sacks of some heavy stuff. My jailers turned the key in the door, and I could hear them shifting their feet as they stood on guard outside. The old boy had gone off in a motor to collect the 2 ruffians who had interviewed me yesterday. Now, they had seen me as the roadman, and they would remember me, for I was in the same rig. What was a roadman doing 20 miles from his beat, pursued by the police? A question or two would put them on track. I tried the shutters, but they were the kind that lock with a key, and I couldn't move them. From the outside came the faint clucking of hens. Then I groped among the sacks and boxes. I couldn't open the latter, and the sacks seemed to be full of things like dog biscuits that smelt of cinnamon. But as I circumnavigated the room, I found a handle in the wall which seemed worth investigating. It was the door of a wall cupboard, what they call a press in Scotland, and it was locked. I shook it, and it seemed rather flimsy. For want of something better to do, I put out my strength on that door. Presently the thing gave with a crash, which I thought would bring in my warders. I waited for a bit, and then started to explore the cupboard shelves. I found an odd vest or 2 in my trouser pockets and struck a light. It went out in a second, but it showed me one thing. There was a little stock of electric torches on one shelf. I picked up one and found it was in working order. With the torch to help me, I investigated further. There were bottles and cases of queer-smelling stuffs, chemicals no doubt for experiments, and there were coils of fine copper wire and hanks of thin oiled silk. There was a box of detonators and a lot of cord for fuses. Then, away at the back of the shelf, I found a stout brown cardboard box, and inside of it a wooden case. I managed to wrench it open, and within lay a dozen little grey bricks, each a couple of inches square. I took up one, and found that it crumbled easily in my hand. Then I smelt it and put my tongue to it. After that, I sat down to think. I hadn't been a mining engineer for nothing, and I knew lentonite when I saw it. With one of these bricks, I could blow the house to smithereens. I'd used the stuff in Rhodesia and knew its power. But the trouble was that my knowledge wasn't exact. I'd forgotten the proper charge and the right way of preparing it, and I wasn't sure about the timing. I got a detonator and fixed it to a couple of feet of fuse. Then I took a quarter of the lentonite brick and buried it near the door below one of the sacks in a crack of the floor, fixing the detonator in it. I ensconced myself just below the sill of the window and lit the fuse. Then I waited for a moment or two. There was dead silence, only a shuffle of heavy boots in the passage and a peaceful cluck of hens from the warm out-of-doors. I commended my soul to my Maker and wondered where I would be in 5 seconds. A great wave of heat seemed to surge upwards from the floor and hang for a blistering instant in the air, and then the wall opposite me flashed into a golden yellow and dissolved with a rending thunder that hammered my brain into a pulp. Something dropped on me, catching the point of my left shoulder. I felt myself being choked by thick yellow fumes and struggled to my feet. Somewhere behind me I felt fresh air. The jambs of the window had fallen, and through the ragged rent the smoke was pouring out to the summer noon. I stepped over the broken lintel and found myself standing in a yard in a dense and acrid fog. I felt very sick and ill, but I could move my limbs, and I staggered blindly forward away from the house. A small mill lade ran in a wooden aqueduct at the other side of the yard, and into this I fell. The cool water revived me, and I'd just enough wits left to think of escape. I squirmed up the lade among the slippery green slime till I reached the mill wheel. Then I wriggled through the axle hole into the old mill and tumbled onto a bed of chaff. A nail caught the seat of my trousers, and I left a wisp of heather mixture material behind me. I looked out of the door and saw a fog still hanging over the house and smoke escaping from an upper window. I could hear confused cries coming from the other side, but I had no time to linger, since this mill was obviously a bad hiding place. I saw that on the far side stood an old stone dovecot. It was mercifully hidden by the mill buildings from any view from the house. I slipped across the space and got to the back of the dovecot and prospected a way of ascent. My shoulder and arm ached like hell, and I was so sick and giddy that I was always on the verge of falling. But I managed it somehow. By the use of out-jutting stones and gaps in the masonry and a tough ivy root, I got to the top in the end. There was a little parapet behind which I found space to lie down. Then I proceeded to go off into an old-fashioned swoon. I woke with a burning head and the sun glaring in my face. Sounds came to me from the house, men speaking throatily and the throbbing of a stationary car. There's a little gap in the parapet from which I had some sort of prospect of the yard. I saw figures come out, a servant with his head bound up, and then a younger man in knickerbockers. They were looking for something, and moved towards the mill. Then one of them caught sight of the wisp of cloth on the nail, and cried out to the other. They both went back into the house, and brought two more out to look at it. I noticed that they all had pistols. For half an hour they ransacked the mill, and then they went back to the house. All that long, blistering afternoon I lay on the rooftop. I had a fine prospect of the whole ring of moorland. I saw the car speed away with two occupants, and a man on a hill pony riding east. I judged they were looking for me, and I wished them joy of their quest. But I saw something else more interesting. The house stood almost on the summit of a swell of moorland which crowned a sort of plateau. The actual summit, as I have mentioned, was a biggish clump of trees, firs mostly, with a few ashes and beeches. The wood was not solid, but only a ring, and inside was an oval of green turf, for all the world like a big cricket field. I didn't take long to guess what it was. It was an aerodrome, and a secret one. When I looked from the dovecot, I could see far away a blue line which I knew was the sea, and I grew furious to think that our enemies had this secret conning tower to rake our waterways. If that aeroplane came back, the chances were 10 to 1 that I would be discovered. So through the afternoon I lay and prayed for the coming of darkness, and glad I was when the sun went down over the big western hills and the twilight haze crept over the moor. The aeroplane was late. The gloaming was far advanced when I heard the beat of wings and saw it volplaning downwards to its home in the wood. Lights twinkled for a bit, and there was much coming and going from the house. Then the dark fell, and silence. About 9 o'clock, so far as I could judge, I dropped as softly as I could onto the hard soil of the yard. I crawled on my belly in the lee of a stone dyke till I reached the fringe of trees which surrounded the house. I did not stop till I had put 6 miles between me and that accursed dwelling. I sat down on a hilltop and took stock of my position. I had a crushing headache and felt as sick as a cat. Also, my shoulder was in a bad way. My plan was to seek Mr. Turnbull's cottage, recover my garments and especially Scudder's notebook, and then make for the main line and get back to the south. It seemed to me that the sooner I got in touch with the Foreign Office man, Sir Walter Bullivant, the better. It was a wonderful starry night, and I had not much difficulty about the road. Sir Harry's map had given me the lie of the land, and all I had to do was steer a point or two west of southwest to come to the stream where I'd met the roadman. I calculated I must be about 18 miles distant, and that meant I could get there before morning. The last bit was completed with set teeth and a very light and dizzy head. But I managed it, and in the early dawn I was knocking at Mr. Turnbull's door. The mist lay close and thick, and from the cottage I could not see the high road. Mr. Turnbull himself opened to me, sober, and something more than sober. At first he did not recognize me. "Why ye that came straying here in a Sabbath morning?" My head was swimming so wildly that I could not frame a coherent answer. Then he recognized me, and he saw that I was ill. "You got my specs?" he asked. I fetched them out of my trouser pocket and gave him them. "You'll have to come for your jacket and waistcoat," he said. "Come in, by. Losh, man, you're terrible down in the legs. Hold up till I get you to a chair." I perceived I was in for a bout of malaria. I had a good deal of fever in my bones, and the wet night had brought it out, while my shoulder and the effects of the fumes combined to make me feel pretty bad. Before I knew, Mr. Turnbull was helping me off with my clothes and putting me to bed in one of the 2 cupboards that lined the kitchen walls. He was a true friend in need, that old roadman. His wife was dead years ago, and since his daughter's marriage he lived alone. For the better part of 10 days he did all the rough nursing I needed. I simply wanted to be left in peace while the fever took its course, and when my skin was cool again, I found that the bout had more or less cured my shoulder. But it was a baddish go, and though I was out of bed in 5 days, it took me some time to get my legs again. As soon as I felt myself fit, I decided to be off. That was not till the 12th day of June, and as luck would have it, a drover went past that morning, taking some cattle to Moffat. He was a man named Hislop, a friend of Turnbull's, and he came to his breakfast with us, and offered to take me with him. I made Turnbull accept £5 for my lodging, and a hard job I had of it. When I told him how much I owed him, he grunted something about a good turn deserving another. Hislop was a cheery soul, and chattered all the way over the pass and down the sunny vale of Annan. A tattered plaid and a venerable hat borrowed from Turnbull gave me a fine theatrical Scots look, and allowed me to travel undetected by any of my pursuers. But driving cattle is a mortally slow job, and we took the better part of a day to cover a 12 miles. I got some dinner in a humble Moffat public-house, and walked the 2 miles to the junction of the main line. The night express for the south was due at midnight. About 8 o'clock the following evening, I descended at a little station of Artinswell, in deepest Berkshire. There were several people on the platform, and I thought I had better wait to ask my way till I was clear of the place. The road led through a wood of great beeches, and then into a shallow valley, with the green backs of downs peeping over the distant trees. Presently I came to a bridge, below which a clear, slow stream flowed between snowy beds of water buttercups. I fell to whistling as I looked into the green depths, and the tune which came to my lips was Annie Laurie. A fisherman came up from the waterside, and as he neared me, he too began to whistle. The tune was infectious, for he followed my suit. He was a huge man, in untidy old flannels and a wide-brimmed hat, with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He leaned his delicate 10-foot split-cane rod against the bridge, and looked with me at the water. "Clear, isn't it?" he said pleasantly. "Look at that big fellow. £4 if he's an ounce." "I don't see him," said I. "Yard from the reeds, just above that stickle." "I've got him now." You might swear he was black stone. So, he said, and whistled another bar of Annie Laurie. That's my house, he said, pointing to a white gate 100 yards on. Wait 5 minutes, and then go round to the back door. And with that he left me. I did as I was bidden. I found a pretty cottage with a lawn running down to the stream and a perfect jungle of guelder rose and lilac flanking the path. A back door stood open, and a grave butler was awaiting me. "Come this way, sir," he said, and led me along the passage and up a back staircase to a pleasant bedroom looking towards the river. There I found a complete outfit laid out for me, dress clothes with all the fixings, brown flannel suit, shirts, collars, ties, shaving things and hairbrushes, and a pair of patent shoes. "Sir Walter thought that Mr. Reggie's things would fit you, sir," said the butler. "He keeps some clothes here, for he comes regular on the weekends. There's a bathroom next door, and I've prepared an hot bath. Dinner in half an hour, sir. You'll hear the gong." The grave being withdrew. I looked at myself in the mirror, and saw a wild, haggard brown fellow, with a fortnight's ragged beard and dust in ears and eyes, collarless, with shapeless old tweed clothes and boots that hadn't been cleaned for the best part of a month. I shaved and bathed luxuriously, and got into the dress clothes, a clean, crackling shirt, which fitted me not so badly. By the time I'd finished, the looking-glass showed a not unpersonable young man. Sir Walter awaited me in a dusky dining-room, where a little round table was lit with silver candles. "I'm more obliged to you than I can say, but I'm bound to make things clear," I said. "I'm an innocent man, but I'm wanted by the police. I've got to tell you this, and I won't be surprised if you kick me out." He smiled. "That's all right. Don't let that interfere with your appetite. We can talk about these things after dinner." I never ate a meal with greater relish, for I had had nothing all day but railway sandwiches. Sir Walter did me proud, for we drank a good champagne and had some uncommon fine port afterwards. We went to his study for coffee, a jolly room full of books and trophies and untidiness and comfort. Then, when coffee cups were cleared away, and we had got our cigars alight, my host swung his long legs over the side of his chair and bade me get started with my yarn. "I've obeyed Harry's instructions," he said, "and the bribe he offered me was that you would tell me something to wake me up. I'm ready, Mr. Hannay." I noticed with a start that he called me by my proper name. I began at the very beginning. I told him of the night that I'd come back to find Scudder gibbering on my doorstep. I told him all Scudder had told me about Carolides and the Foreign Office conference, and that made him purse his lips and grin. Then I got to the murder, and he grew solemn again. He heard all about the milkman and my time in Galloway, and my deciphering Scudder's notes at the inn. "You got them here?" he asked sharply, and he drew a long breath when I whipped the little book from my pocket and proceeded with my tale. Presently I reached the end of my wanderings. He got up slowly and looked down at me from the hearthrug. "You may dismiss the police from your mind," he said. "You're in no danger from the law of this land." "Why?" I asked in amazement. "Principally because I received a letter from Scudder. I knew something of the man, and he did several jobs for me. He was half crank, half genius, but he was wholly honest. I had a letter from him on the 31st of May, but he'd been dead a week by then. The letter was written and posted on the 23rd. He evidently did not anticipate an immediate decease. His communications usually took a week to reach me, for they were sent under cover to Spain and then to Newcastle. He had a mania, you know, for concealing his tracks." "What did he say?" "Merely that he was in danger, and had found shelter with a good friend, and that I would hear from him before the 15th of June. He gave me no address, but said he was living near Portland Place. I think his object was to clear you if anything happened. When I got it, I went to Scotland Yard, went over the details of the inquest, and concluded that you were the friend. We made inquiries about you, Mr. Hannay, and found you were respectable. I thought I knew the motives for your disappearance, and when I got Harry's scrawl, I guessed the rest. I've been expecting you any time this past week." I felt a free man once more, for I was now up against my country's enemies only, and not my country's law. "Now let us have the little notebook," said Sir Walter. It took us a good hour to work through it. I explained the cipher, and he was quick at picking it up. He amended my reading of it on several points, but I'd been fairly correct on the whole. His face was very grave before he had finished, and he sat silent for a while. "I don't know what to make of it," he said at last. "He is right about one thing, what is going to happen the day after tomorrow. How the devil can it have got known? But all about the war and the Black Stone, it reads like some wild melodrama. The Black Stone. Der Schwarzestein. It's like penny novelette. And all this stuff about Keralides. That's the weak part of the whole tale. For I happen to know that the virtuous Keralides is likely to outlast us both. There's no state in Europe that wants him gone. No, Scudder's gone off track there." Just then the butler entered the room. "There's a trunk call from London, Sir Walter. It's Mr. Eath. He wants to speak to you personally." My host went off to the telephone. He returned in 5 minutes with a whitish face. "I apologize to the shade of Scudder," he said. "Keralides was shot dead this evening at a few minutes after 7. I came down to breakfast the next morning, after 8 hours of blessed, dreamless sleep, to find Sir Walter decoding a telegram in the midst of muffins and marmalade. "I had a busy hour on the telephone after you went to bed," he said. "I got my chief to speak to the First Sea Lord and the Secretary for War, and they're bringing General Royer over from France a day sooner. He's the French commander-in-chief. This wire clinches it. He'll be in London at 5. He directed me to the hot dishes and went on. "Not that I think it will do much good. If your friends were clever enough to find out the first arrangement, they're clever enough to discover the change. I'd give my head to know where the leak is. We believe there were only 5 men in England who knew about Royer's visit, and you may be certain there were fewer in France, for they manage things better there." "Can the naval dispositions not be changed?" I asked. "They are the result of immense thought, and no alteration would be as good. Still, something could be done, I suppose, if it were absolutely necessary. But you see the difficulty, Hannay. Our enemies are not going to be such fools as to pick Royer's pocket, or any childish game like that. They know that would mean a row and put us on our guard. Their aim is to get the details without any one of us knowing, so that Royer will go back to Paris in the belief that the whole business is still deadly secret. If they can't do that, they fail, for once we suspect, they know that the whole thing must be altered." "Then we must stick by the Frenchman's side till he is home again," I said. "If they thought that they could get the information in Paris, they would try there. It means that they have got some deep scheme on foot in London which they reckon is going to win out. Royer dines with my chief and then comes to my house where the crucial meeting is taking place. At my house, Royer will get certain documents from Whittaker, the Navy Minister, and after that he will be motored to Portsmouth, where a destroyer will take him to Havre. He will never be left unattended for a moment until he is safe on French soil. The same with Whittaker till he meets Royer. That's the best we can do. It's hard to see how there can be any miscarriage, but I don't mind admitting that I'm horribly nervous. This murder of Keralides will play the deuce with the chancelleries of Europe." After breakfast, he asked me if I could drive a car. "Well, you'll be my chauffeur today and wear Hudson's rig. You're about his size. We'll take no risks while you're still a wanted man." I landed Sir Walter at his house in Queen Anne's Gate punctually by 11:30. The first thing he did after I'd abandoned my disguise was to take me round to Scotland Yard. There we saw a prim gentleman with a clean-shaven lawyer's face. "I brought you the Portland Place murderer," was Sir Walter's introduction. The reply was a wry smile. "Would have been a welcome present, Bullivant. This, I presume, is Mr. Richard Hannay, who for some days greatly interested my department?" "Mr. Hannay has much to tell you, but not today. For certain grave reasons his tale must wait for 24 hours. I want you to assure Mr. Hannay that he will suffer no further inconvenience." This assurance was promptly given. "And we may want your assistance later on, MacGillivray," Sir Walter said as we left. "Come and see me tomorrow, Hannay. I needn't tell you to keep deadly quiet. You'd better lie low, for if one of your Blackstone friends saw you, there might be trouble." As the hours passed, a strange restlessness possessed me. I felt a sense of danger and impending calamity. I was convinced that somehow I was needed to help this business through, that without me it would all go to blazes. I told myself it was sheer silly conceit, that 4 or 5 of the cleverest people living, with all the might of the British Empire at their back, had the job in hand. Yet I couldn't be convinced. It seemed as if a voice kept speaking in my ear, telling me to be up and doing, or I would never sleep again. The upshot was, at about 9:30, I made up my mind to go to Queen Anne's Gate. Sir Walter's house was in the narrow part, and outside it 3 or 4 motor cars were drawn up. I walked briskly up to the door. I'd scarcely rung before the door was opened by the butler. "I must see Sir Walter," I said. "My business is important." He held the door open and then shut it behind me. "Sir Walter is engaged, sir. Perhaps you will wait." The house was of the old-fashioned kind, with a wide hall and rooms on both sides of it. At the far end was an alcove with a telephone and a couple of chairs, and there the butler offered me a seat. I hadn't waited long before there came another ring at the bell. The butler made no bones about admitting this new visitor. While he was taking off his coat, I saw who it was. You couldn't open a newspaper or magazine without seeing that face, the grey beard cut like a spade, the firm fighting mouth, the blunt square nose and the keen blue eyes. I recognized Lord Alloa, the first Sea Lord, the man, they say, that made the new British Navy. He passed my alcove and was ushered into a room at the back of the hall. As the door opened, I could hear the sound of low voices. It shut, and I was left alone again. For 20 minutes I sat there, wondering what I was to do next. Then I heard a bell ring, and the butler appeared. The door of the back room opened, and the first Sea Lord came out. He walked past me, and in passing he glanced in my direction, and for a second we looked each other in the face. Only for a second, but it was enough to make my heart jump. I'd never seen the great man before, and he had never seen me, but in that fraction of time something sprang into his eyes, and that something was recognition. You can't mistake it. It is a flicker, a spark of light, a minute shade of difference which means one thing and one thing only. It came involuntarily, for in a moment it died, and he passed on. I heard the street door close behind him. I picked up the telephone book and looked up the number of the first Sea Lord's house. We were connected at once, and I heard a servant's voice. "Is his lordship at home?" I asked. "His lordship returned half an hour ago," said the voice, "and has gone to bed. He's not very well tonight. Will you leave a message, sir?" I rang off. My part in this business was not yet ended. It had been a close shave, but I had been in time. I marched to the door of that back room and entered without knocking. 5 surprised faces looked up from the round table. There was Sir Walter, and Drew, the War Minister, whom I knew from his photographs. There was a slim, elderly man who was probably Whitaker, the Admiralty official, and there was General Winstanley, conspicuous from the long scar on his forehead. Lastly, there was a short, stout man, with an iron-grey moustache and bushy eyebrows, who had been arrested in the middle of a sentence. Sir Walter's face showed surprise and annoyance. "This is Mr. Hannay, of whom I have spoken to you," he said apologetically to the company. "I am afraid, Hannay, this visit is ill-timed." "That remains to be seen, sir," I said, "but I think it may be in the nick of time. For God's sake, gentlemen, tell me who went out a moment ago." "Lord Alloa," Sir Walter said, reddening with anger. "It was not," I cried. "It was his living image, but it was not Lord Alloa. It was someone who recognized me, someone I have seen in the last month. He had scarcely left the doorstep when I rang up Lord Alloa's house and was told that he had come in half an hour before and had gone to bed." Sir Walter got up, left the room while we looked blankly at the table. He came back in 10 minutes with a long face. "I've spoken to Alloa. Had him out of bed, very grumpy. He went straight home after Mulross's dinner."
"But it's madness,"
broke in General Winstanley.
"Do you mean to tell me that that man came here and sat beside me for the best part of half an hour? I didn't detect the imposture."
"Don't you see the cleverness of it?" I said. "You were too interested in other things to have any eyes. You took Lord Alloa for granted. If it had been anybody else, you might have looked more closely. But it's natural for him to be here, and that put you all to sleep." Then the Frenchman spoke, very slowly and in good English. "The young man is right. His psychology is good. Our enemies have not been foolish."
"The one thing that puzzles me," said the General, "is what good his visit here would do. He couldn't carry away several pages of figures and strange names in his head."
"That is not difficult," the Frenchman replied. "A good spy is trained to have a photographic memory. You noticed he said nothing, but went through the papers again and again. I think we may assume that he has every detail stamped in his mind. When I was younger, I could do the same trick." "Well, I suppose there is nothing for it but to change the plans," said Sir Walter ruefully. "Another thing must be said." It was Royer who spoke. "I talked freely when that man was here. I told something of the military plans of my government. I was permitted to say so much, but that information would be worth many millions to our enemies. The man who came here and his confederates must be taken, and taken at once." "Good God," I cried, "and we have not a rag of a clue." "Besides," said Whitaker, "there is the post. By this time the news will be on its way." "No," said the Frenchman. "You do not understand the habits of a spy. He receives personally his reward, and he delivers personally his intelligence. We in France know something of the breed. There is still a chance, mes amis. These men must cross the sea, and there are ships to be searched and ports to be watched. Believe me, the need is desperate both for France and Britain." I saw no hope in any face, and I felt none. Then suddenly I had an inspiration. "Where's Scudder's book?" I cried to Sir Walter. He unlocked the door of a bureau and gave it to me. I found the place. 39 steps, I read. 39 steps. I counted them. High tide, 10:17 p.m. The Admiralty man was looking at me as if he thought I had gone mad. "Don't you see, it's a clue. Scudder knew where these fellows led. He knew where they were going to leave the country, though he kept the name to himself. Tomorrow was the day, and it was some place where high tide was 10:17. "But they may have gone tonight," someone said. "Not they. They have their own snug secret way, and they won't be hurried. I know Germans, and they are mad about working to a plan.
Where the devil can I get a book of tide tables? Whittaker brightened up. It's a chance, he said. Let's go over to the Admiralty. We got into two of the waiting motor cars, all but Sir Walter, who went off to Scotland Yard to mobilise MacGillivray, so he said. We marched through empty corridors and big bare chambers where the charwomen were busy, till we reached a little room lined with books and maps. A resident clerk was unearthed, and we presently fetched from the library the Admiralty tide tables. It was no good. There were hundreds of entries, and as far as I could see, 1017 might cover 50 places. We had to find some way of narrowing the possibilities. Sir Walter had joined us, and presently MacGillivray arrived. He had sent out instructions to watch the ports and railway stations for the three men whom I had described to Sir Walter. Not that he or anybody else thought that that would do much good. Here's the most I can make of it, I said. We've got to find a place where there are several staircases down to the beach, one of which has 39 steps. I think it's a piece of open coast with biggish cliffs somewhere between the Wash and the Channel. Also, it's a place where full tide is 10:17 tomorrow night. Then an idea struck me. Is there no inspector of Coast Guards or some fellow like that who knows the East Coast? Whittaker said there was, and that he lived in Clapham. He went off in a car to fetch him, and the rest of us sat about in the little room and talked of anything that came into our minds. At 1 in the morning, the Coast Guard man arrived. I left the War Minister to cross-examine him. We want you to tell us the places you know on the East Coast where there are cliffs and where several sets of steps run down to the beach. He reflected a minute or two. There's a place in Norfolk, Brattlesham, beside a golf course, where there are a couple of staircases to let the gentleman get a lost ball. That's not it, I said. Then there are plenty of marine parades, if that's what you mean. Every seaside resort has them. I shook my head. It's got to be more retired than that, I said. Well, gentlemen, I can't think of anywhere else. Of course, there's the Rough. What's that? I asked. The big chalk headland in Kent, close to Bradgate. It's got a lot of villas on the top, and some of the houses have staircases down to a private beach. I tore open the tide tables and found Bradgate. High tide there was at 10:27 on the 15th of June. We're on the scent at last, I cried excitedly. How can I find out what is the tide at the Rough? I can tell you that, sir, said the Coast Guard man. I once was lent a house there in this very month, and I used to go out at night to the deep-sea fishing. The tide there is 10 minutes before Bradgate. I closed the book and looked round at the company. If one of those staircases has 39 steps, we've solved the mystery, gentlemen. A pink and blue June morning found me at Bradgate, looking from the Griffin Hotel over a smooth sea to the lightship on the Cock Sands, which seemed the size of a bellboy. A couple of miles further south and much nearer the shore, a small destroyer was anchored. Scaife, MacGillivray's man, who had been in the Navy, knew the boat and told me her name and her commander's, so I sent off a wire to Sir Walter. After breakfast, Scaife got from a house agent a key for the gates of the staircases on the Rough. I walked with him along the sands and sat down in a nook of the cliffs while he investigated the half-dozen of them. I didn't want to be seen, but the place at this hour was quite deserted. It took him more than an hour to do the job, and when I saw him coming towards me, conning a bit of paper, my heart was in my mouth. He read aloud the number of steps in the different stairs, 34, 35, 39, 42, 47, and 21, where the cliffs grew lower. We hurried back to the town and sent a wire to MacGillivray. Then Scaife set out to prospect the house at the head of the 39 steps. The house was called Trafalgar Lodge, he reported, and it belonged to an old gentleman called Appleton, a retired stockbroker, the house agent said. Mr. Appleton was there a good deal in the summer-time, and was in residence now. He had been for the better part of a week. He was a very decent old fellow who paid his bills regularly, and was always good for a fiver for a local charity. 3 servants were kept, a cook, a parlour-maid, and a housemaid. I borrowed Scaife's telescope, and before lunch went for a walk along the Rough. I found a good observation point on the edge of the golf course. There I had a view of the line of turf along the cliff top, with seats placed at intervals, and the little square plots railed in and planted with bushes, whence the staircases descended to the beach. I saw Trafalgar Lodge very plainly, a red brick villa with a veranda, with the tennis lawn behind. Presently I observed someone leave the house and saunter along the cliff. When I got my glasses on him, I saw it was an old man, wearing white flannel trousers, a blue serge jacket and a straw hat. He carried a newspaper, and sat down on one of the iron seats and began to read. I watched him for half an hour, till he got up and went back to the house. I wasn't feeling very confident. The man might be the bald archaeologist on the moorland farm, or he might not. He was exactly the kind of old bird you will find in every suburb and every holiday place. After lunch, as I sat in the hotel porch, I saw the thing I hoped for. A steam yacht came up from the south and dropped anchor pretty well opposite the Rough. She seemed about 150 tons, and I saw she belonged to the squadron from the White Ensign. So Scaife and I went down to the harbour and hired a boatman for an afternoon's fishing. About 4 o'clock, when we had fished enough, I made the boatman row us round the yacht, which lay like a delicate white bird. Her name was the Ariadne. I spoke to one of the men who was polishing brasswork, and got an answer in the soft dialect of Essex. Another hand that came along passed me the time of day in an unmistakable English tongue. Then the men suddenly disregarded us and bent their heads to their work as an officer came along the deck. He was a pleasant, clean-looking young fellow, and he put a question to us about our fishing in very good English. But there could be no doubt about him. His close-cropped head and the cut of his collar and tie never came out of England. We rowed back to Bradgate. In the hotel I met the commander of the destroyer, to whom Scaife introduced me, and with whom I had a few words. Then I thought I would put in an hour or two watching Trafalgar Lodge. I found a place further up the hill, in the garden of an empty house. From there I had a full view of the court, on which 2 figures were having a game of tennis. One was the old man, whom I had already seen. The other was a younger fellow, wearing some club colours in the scarf round his middle. You couldn't conceive a more innocent spectacle. Presently a third figure arrived, a young man on a bicycle with a bag of golf clubs slung on his back. He strolled round to the tennis lawn and was welcomed riotously by the players. Evidently they were chaffing him, and their chaff sounded thoroughly English. They all went into the house and left me feeling a perfect idiot. And yet there were 3 of them, and one was old, and one was plump, and one was lean and dark, and their house chimed in with Scudder's notes, and half a mile off was lying a steam yacht with at least 1 German officer. I thought of Karolides lying dead, and all Europe trembling on the edge of earthquake. There seemed only one thing to do: go forward as if I had no doubts, and if I was going to make a fool of myself, to do it handsomely. It was now getting on for 8 o'clock, and I went back and saw Scaife to give him his instructions. I arranged with him how to place his men, and then I went for a walk round the deserted golf course, and then onto a point on the cliffs further north beyond the line of the villas. Out at sea, in the blue dusk, I saw lights appear on the Ariadne and on the destroyer away to the south, and beyond the Cock Sands the bigger lights of steamers making for the Thames. The whole scene seemed so peaceful and ordinary that I got more dashed in spirits every second. It took all my resolution to stroll towards Trafalgar Lodge about 9:30. I opened the gate and rang the bell. When a trim parlour-maid opened the door, I could hardly find my voice. I asked for Mr. Appleton and was ushered in. My plan had been to walk straight into the dining-room and by a sudden appearance wake in the men that start of recognition which would confirm my theory. But when I found myself in that neat hall, the place mastered me. There were the golf clubs and tennis rackets, the straw hats and caps, the rows of gloves, the sheaf of walking sticks which you will find in 10,000 British homes. The place was as orthodox as an Anglican church. When the maid asked me for my name, I gave it automatically. I managed to pull myself together and go after her. But I was too late. She had already entered the dining-room and given my name to her master, and I had missed the chance of seeing how the three took it. When I walked into the room, the old man at the head of the table had risen and turned round to meet me. He was in evening dress, as was the plump one. The third, the dark fellow, wore a blue serge suit and soft white collar, and the colours of some club or school. The old man's manner was perfect. "Mr. Hannay," he said hesitatingly, "do you wish to see me?" I pulled up a chair and sat down on it. "I think we've met before," I said, "and I guess you know my business." So far as I could see their faces, they'd played the part of mystification very well. Maybe, said the old man. "I haven't a very good memory, but I'm afraid you must tell me your errand, sir, for I really don't know it." "I have here a warrant for the arrest of you three gentlemen." "Arrest?" said the old man, and he looked really shocked. "Arrest? Good God! What for?" "For the murder of Franklin Scudder in London on the 23rd day of last month." "I've never heard that name before," said the old man in a dazed voice. One of the others spoke up. "That was the Portland Place murder. I read about it. Good heavens, you must be mad, sir. Where do you come from?" "Scotland Yard." After that, for a minute, there was utter silence. Then the plump one spoke up. "Don't get flustered, Uncle. It's all a ridiculous mistake. But these things happen sometimes, and we can easily set it right. It won't be hard to prove our innocence. I can show that I was out of the country on the 23rd of May, and Bob was in a nursing home. You were in London, but you can explain what you were doing." "The 23rd? Oh, that was the day after Agatha's wedding. What was I doing? I came up in the morning from Woking and lunched at the club with Charlie Simmons. Then, oh, yes, I dined with the fishmongers, I remember, for the punch didn't agree with me, and I was seedy next morning." "I think, sir," said the young man, "you will see you are mistaken. We want to assist the law like all Englishmen, and we don't want Scotland Yard to be making fools of themselves. That's so, Uncle?" "Certainly, Bob." The old fellow seemed to be recovering his voice. "Certainly. We'll do anything in our power to assist the authorities." The light from the dinner-table candlesticks was not very good, and to cover my confusion I got up, walked to the door, and switched on the electric light. The sudden glare made them blink, and I stood scanning the three faces. One was old and bald. One was stout. One was dark and thin. There was nothing in their appearance to prevent them from being the three who had hunted me in Scotland, but there was nothing to identify them. I simply can't explain why I, who as a roadman had looked into two pairs of eyes, and as Ned Ainsley into another pair, why I, who have a good memory and reasonable powers of observation, could find no satisfaction. They seemed exactly what they professed to be, and I could not have sworn to one of them. "Well," said the old man politely, "are you reassured by your scrutiny, sir?" I couldn't find a word. "I hope you'll find it consistent with your duty to drop this ridiculous business. I make no complaint, but you'll see how annoying it must be to respectable people." "Do you propose to march us off to the police station?" asked the thin one. "That might be the best way out of it, but I suppose you won't be content with the local branch. I have the right to ask to see your warrant, but I don't wish to cast any aspersions on you. You're only doing your duty, but you'll admit it's horribly awkward. What do you propose to do?"
There was nothing to do, except to call in my men and have them arrested, or to confess my blunder and clear out. I felt mesmerized by the whole place, by the air of obvious innocence. Not innocence merely, but frank, honest bewilderment and concern in the three faces.
"Meantime, I vote we have a game of bridge," said the plump one. "It will give Mr. Hannay time to think over things. And you know, we've been wanting a fourth player. Do play, sir."
I accepted, as if it had been an ordinary invitation at the club. We went into the smoking room, where a card table was set out, and I was offered things to smoke and drink. I took my place at the table in a kind of dream. The window was open, and the moon was flooding the cliffs and sea with a great tide of yellow light. There was moonshine, too, in my head. The three had recovered their composure and were talking easily, just the kind of slangy talk you will hear in any golf clubhouse. They saw that they had got me puzzled, and that put them more than ever at their ease. Then something awoke me. The old man laid down his hand to light a cigar. He didn't pick it up at once, but sat back for a moment in his chair with his fingers tapping on his knee. It was a movement I remembered when I had stood before him in the moorland house, with the pistols of his servants behind me. A little thing, lasting only a second, and the odds were 1,000 to 1 that I might have missed it, but I didn't. In a flash the air seemed to clear, some shadow lifted from my brain, and I was looking at the three men with full and absolute recognition. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 10 o'clock. The three faces seemed to change before my eyes and reveal their secrets. The young one was the murderer. His knife, I made certain, had skewered Scudder to the floor. His kind had put the bullet in Keralides. The plump man's features seemed to fade and form again as I looked at them. He hadn't a face, only 100 masks that he could assume when he pleased. Perhaps he had been Lord Alloa of the night before. Perhaps not. It didn't matter. Scudder had said he lisped, and I could imagine how the adoption of a lisp might add terror. But the old man was the pick of the lot. He was sheer brain, icy, cool, calculating, as ruthless as a steam hammer. Now that my eyes were opened, I wondered where I had seen the benevolence. His jaw was like chill steel, and his eyes had the inhuman luminosity of a bird's. I went on playing, and every second a greater hate welled up in my heart. "Phew, Bob, look at the time," said the old man. "You'd better think about catching your train. Bob's got to go to town tonight," he added, turning to me. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 10:30. "I'm afraid he must put off his journey," I said. "Oh, damn," said the young man. "I thought you had dropped that rot. I've got to go. You can have my address. I'll give any security you like." "No," I said. "You must stay." The old man spoke again. "I'll go bail for my nephew. That ought to content you, Mr. Hannay." Was it fancy, or did I detect some halt in the smoothness of that voice? There must have been, for as I glanced at him, his eyelids fell in that hawk-like hood which fear had stamped on my memory. I blew my whistle. In an instant the lights were out. A pair of strong arms gripped me round the waist. "Schnell, Franz!" cried a voice. "Das Boot! Das Boot!" As it spoke, I saw two of my fellows emerge on the moonlit lawn. The young dark man leapt
for the window and was through it, and over the low fence before a hand could touch him. I grappled the old chap, and the room seemed to fill with figures. I saw the plump one collared, but my eyes were all for the out-of-doors, where Franz sped on over the road towards the railed entrance to the beach stairs. One man followed him, but he had no chance. The gates of the stairs locked behind the fugitive, and I stood staring, with my hands on the old boy's throat, for such a time as a man might take to descend those stairs to the sea. Suddenly my prisoner broke from me and flung himself towards the wall. There was a click, as if a lever had been pulled. Then came a low rumbling, far, far below the ground, and through the window I saw a cloud of chalky dust pouring out of the shaft of the stairway. Someone switched on the light. The old man was looking at me with blazing eyes. "He is safe," he cried. "You cannot follow him in time. He is gone. He has triumphed. The black stone, der schwarze Stein, ist in der Siegeskrone." There was more in those eyes than any common triumph. A white, fanatic heat burned in them, and I realized for the first time the terrible thing I had been up against. This man was more than a spy. In his foul way, he had been a patriot. As the handcuffs clinked on his wrists, I said, "I hope Franz will bear his triumph well. I ought to tell you that the Ariadne for the last hour has been in our hands." 7 weeks later, as all the world knows, we went to war. I joined the new army the first week, and owing to my Matabele experience, got a captain's commission straight off. But I had done my best service, I think, before I put on khaki.